What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today for another one of my top 10 videos, and this time I'm going into the wonderful and wild and sordid and provocative and oftentimes shocking world of cult cinema. On this channel recently, I've been talking a lot about fantasy, and I love fantasy, but I don't want to live off a diet exclusively of fantasy, so I thought the best palate cleanser would be to talk about a bunch of movies that are on the other end of the spectrum, where they are oftentimes low budget, they're shot on the streets, they're grimy, they're rough, they're ruthless, they push all of our buttons. And this was the first top 10 video where I really struggled over which movies should make the list. Should I do my top 10 favorite cult films? Should I do the top 10 of most historical significance in terms of opening up the midnight movie circuit in the 70s? And so I went to some of my favorite film commentators out there and sought out an array of opinions and suggestions. And these are people who have seen more than their fair share of obscure films. So I feel like I've got about 200 strong contenders that could easily make this list. So rather than make this a top 10 list, I'm just going to make it volume 1. Because the great Danny Perry, he wrote many, many books on cult films, where they're talking about cult midnight films or cult science fiction films, or whatever the case might be. And oftentimes in those books, he would tackle 15, 20 movies. So to be continued on this topic, but I feel like I've got 10 really solid choices for today. Plus, a lot of my favorite cult films have already popped up in previous top 10 lists, like my top 10 30s horror video or my top 10 Brian De Palma video. So I'll leave a link in the description below for that playlist. But what I can say about all of my selections is that they've all proven to have a lot of cultural stickiness. And what I mean by that is we live in an era where we're just flooded, just awash in disposable content all day, every day. I mean, whether it's blog posts or podcasts or YouTube videos, most of this content is designed to be consumed on the day of and then quickly forgotten. And I feel like a lot of movies and TV shows are sadly falling into that trap. Like, name the top 10 most popular movies on Netflix in the past year, and you'd be like, oh, God, like I can't even remember what I saw last weekend. But these cult films, they stick around and they remain shocking and they remain exciting and they remain visceral and vital many decades after their release. And I just find that I need to spend more time celebrating these kinds of movies as opposed to opining on things that'll be forgotten this time next week. But the most important, vital question about cult films is, what is a cult film? I mean, my mother, I remember when I was younger, I referred to a movie as a cult classic, and she said, well, James, cults are dangerous. For her, cult meant something very different. But one person's cult film can be another person's obvious classic. And often happens with a lot of cult films, they start out as a cult film, they're hard to find, they're hard to see, but they have a rabid following. Then they'll kind of transition into an acknowledged cult classic with restorations and re-releases and that sort of thing. And then there's a strange thing that'll occur to a lot of them where they just become a classic movie. What's the difference between a cult classic and a classic movie? I guess if Turner Classic Movies is playing it and it has that kind of cultural prestige where it smells like something that's safely kind of tucked away under glass, it has become a classic movie. But a lot of these movies, I feel like it's almost unfair to push them into that category because at that point you're not acknowledging how they can continue to really poke and prod and stimulate our imaginations in really unconventional, oftentimes unseemly ways. And what this phenomenon reminds me of is that classic line from the movie Chinatown where John Huston says, "I'm old. Politicians, ugly buildings, and whores all get respectable if they last long enough." And the same holds true for cult classics. If they stick around long enough, inevitably, even if their filmmaker would be horrified to learn this, they become respectable. I mean, at this point, even Pink Flamingos from 1972 has become respectable, or at least it's respectable until people revisit the movie and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe that John Waters fucking shot this shit. So I think we can all agree that the term is very subjective. But for me, for my definition, first and foremost, it has to be more than an obscure film. There are thousands upon thousands of obscure films out there where people like them, people watch them, people discuss them, people enjoy them. They have the Blu-ray, it's on their wall. But a cult film has to be something more. I think on the whole, it initially needs to be widely disparaged and slammed by a lot of conventional mainstream critics. And I think it also needs to have the almost religious fervor and vocal support of some true lunatics where their entire lives kind of revolve around the celebration of this particular movie. And the more the movie is shat upon from a great height by conventional critics, the more these lunatics tend to fiercely defend these movies and kind of hold them close to their heart. And there are no hard and fast rules about how a movie becomes a cult movie, because some of these movies on my list started out as relatively big budget movies that were then driven into obscurity, and some of them start out as like a true underground movie that becomes a classic over time. But here are the bullet points for what can help identify a cult movie. First and foremost, low budget, that always helps. It's shown at drive-ins or grindhouse theaters or midnight screenings, and oftentimes tough, if not impossible to find, especially back in the 70s before VHS, etc., and so forth. But yeah, being hard to track down and having to find a rare screening, that can be one of the drivers. But more importantly, I think it needs to have some shocking graphic content of either a sexual or violent or subversive nature that you would never see in a Hollywood movie or a Hollywood show. And over time, decades later, these movies tend to remain very kinky and very shocking and very, very provocative. And usually when a movie is shocking, that fades off really, really fast with the passage of time. But as you'll see with the movies that I've chosen, they still pack a punch many decades later. And speaking of many decades later, another key driver, very long shelf lives. Cult movies tend to grow over time as opposed to fading away over time. The fans keep coming back. The fans memorize the dialogue. They perform it on the stage, like with Rocky Horror Picture Show. And it always helps if the movie's really good, but that's not required. Some cult classics are really shitty movies, but that's not really my style to like love bad movies or like to celebrate them for how awful they are. I know there are plenty of people out there who do love to celebrate movies for how clumsy they can be, but you'll see with the 10 movies on this list, every single one of them is a movie that I genuinely, sincerely love. Now, this next criteria might just be from my point of view, but I feel like it always helps if it was shot on the streets of New York, or at a bare minimum associated with some of the midnight theaters here in New York, or like playing on 42nd Street in the late 70s and early 80s. There's something about that grimy, kind of dangerous period in New York where film culture was alive and well, but the city was kind of wild and unruly and dangerous. That always helps lend a movie a little cult flavor. An X rating also helps. Some of these movies were rated X upon initial release. It's not required, but it always helps. But I think the final criteria is whether or not Danny Peary wrote about these movies in all of his books. I mean, his books, cult midnight movies, cult crime movies, cult horror movies, cult science fiction movies. He kind of has the final word on what makes a movie cult, because he was writing about cult movies at a time where they're still really fucking hard to see. And I've discovered a lot of my favorite cult movies through him. And what's interesting is how I don't always agree with his conclusions about these movies. He has a kind of slightly high moral tone considering the subject matter that he's discussing. But here is his definition. In his intro to all of his books, he wrote, "Cult movies were once considered to be only those obscure pictures that were admired by a small, sad coterie of film experts and other social outcasts. But I choose to define cult movies quite broadly. I consider them those special films that elicit a fiery passion in moviegoers long after their initial releases, that have been taken to heart as if they were abandoned orphans in a hostile world, cherished, protected, and enthusiastically championed by segments of the movie audience that are integral parts of people's lives. Cultists don't merely enjoy their favorite movies. They worship them, seek them out wherever they're playing, see them repeatedly, and are intent on persuading anyone who will listen that they should be appreciated regardless of what reviewers thought. They will brave blizzards, skip their weddings, ignore the most solemn religious holidays, or even date their least appealing cousins to see a film for what may be their 10th, 20th, or 100th time. When you speak of cult movies, you speak in extremes. Hardcore cultists, ranging from polite to lunatic, insist that their favorite films are the most intriguing, unusual, outrageous, mysterious, absurd, daring, entertaining, erotic, exotic, and/or best films of all time." I mean, you can't do better than that. That's why Danny Peary's Danny Peary. And luckily these days there's so many boutique companies that play a large role in keeping these movies alive, whether you're talking about the Criterion Collection or Vinegar Syndrome or whatever the case might be. But I do need to give a shout out to a few theaters here in New York that were a vital part of the midnight movie circuit, and the most famous of which, I don't know if it's the Elgin or the Elgin, but the Elgin Theater, which is pretty close by to where I live here in New York, is at the corner of 19th Street and 8th Ave. And it played movies from 1942 to 1978. And this is where the midnight movie screenings of El Topo got underway in 1970. And the success of El Topo led to a ton of other midnight movies playing at this theater. And the success of the midnight screenings there led to midnight screenings popping up all over the country. I mean, even like small towns like Greensboro, North Carolina, where I lived in the 1980s, even there you would find some midnight movie screenings of certain flicks. Sadly, the Waverly Theater where Danny Perry saw a lot of these movies no longer exists either. However, on the ground where it stood, we now have the IFC Center, where I've been fortunate enough to attend a ton of midnight movie screenings. That's one of the best theaters in New York. So the tradition is alive and well. It's just changed and it's always mutating, but I think I've rambled enough at this point. Let's get into some of these goddamn movies. And once again, this is volume 1, not a top 10 list, so I'm just going to go through the movies alphabetically. So my first movie, this director has a couple of movies that could have easily made the list. I mean, one of his movies was regarded by John Waters as not only the best movie he'd ever seen, but the best movie that would ever be made, and that would be Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. However, instead of that more obvious choice, I'm going to go with one that might receive a little bit of pushback because of its budget. However, Danny Perry included it in his list, so it qualifies, and I'm going to go with Beyond the Valley of the Dolls from 1970.
This is Russ Meyer, 240 pounds of creative energy. For years, he's been making very moving pictures for very little money. Yet there was something about his films, like The Immoral Mr. Tease and Vixen, that sparked the public's imagination.
Now, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls had a pretty sizable budget. It was made by Russ Meyer over at Fox. This is when Russ Meyer kind of sort of briefly went mainstream, and he worked on the screenplay famously with Roger Ebert, and it was skewered in its day by critics. However, it was just beloved on college campuses, and I would say now that more than 50 years later, there is a huge cult following surrounding it, and it has many admirers, including filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, as well as John Waters, who described it as one of the best movies ever made. And here are a few of the reviews from when it initially came out. Roger Ebert's future partner in crime, Gene Siskel, gave it 0 stars out of 4 and wrote that the film unfolds with all the humor and excitement of a padded bra. Boredom aplenty is provided by a screenplay which for some reason has been turned over to a screenwriting neophyte. He would then later include it on his 20 worst films of the year. And then Charles Champlin of the Los Angeles Times panned the movie as a treat for the emotionally retarded, sexually inadequate, and dim-witted. It is a grievously sick melange of hyper-mammalian girls, obvious double entendres, and sadistic violence. I mean, for me, that all sounds like a positive thing, but I'll just put it like this in my own words. I think it's a strong contender for the most entertaining movie ever made by a human being. And it's grotesquely over the top and wildly over stylized, but that's kind of the point. This is a movie of pure, raw excess where a bunch of rocker chicks head out to LA and we just get to follow all the trials and tribulations and peaks and valleys of their lives out there. And of course, because it's a Russ Meyer movie, it's filled with wildly attractive women, many of whom had already appeared in the pages of Playboy. But it's also got these insane rock and roll tunes that are way better than they ever should have been. And they almost like, they have a strange, weird, melancholy power that can't even really put into words why the music is so appealing to me. But the music, it just fucking works. But the comedy's great, the freaks are great, the garish colors are great. I just love everything about this movie. I have no idea how many times I've seen it, but I will continue to watch it on a loop for the rest of my life. But let's get into the next movie on my list, which is probably the most obvious, but it has to be included. El Topo from 1970, the movie that really got the midnight movie phenomenon up and running from director Alejandro Jodorowsky. And there had obviously been a million cult films before this. I mean, go look at like the 1930s, like look at a low-budget movie like Maniac. There were obscure, cool flicks that were out there that were, Reefer Madness or whatever the case might be. But with El Topo, you have what should have been an underground movie generating legit box office, thanks to some people like John Lennon, who saw it and urged a close friend of his to buy the rights and take charge of distribution. And this was not Alejandro Jodorowsky's first film, but it's definitely one of his most audacious, where you have what some people describe as an acid western or a psychedelic western. And it's kind of a western for at least like the first half of the movie, but then it just goes into very strange territory. I kind of find the second half of the movie to be unendurable, but the first half is absolutely riveting with this surrealistic, violent quest for enlightenment with an awe-inspiring score and great philosophical lectures like "Now you are 7 and you are now a man" and so on and so forth, or strange gun duels that come at the end of a squealing balloon. Or the fact that Alejandro Jodorowsky's son is basically nude for the first 20, 30 minutes, sharing in all of his ventures before he gets swapped out for this really, really hot girl when he embarks upon this quest to kill the 4 masters of the gun that live out in the desert. So if you've only seen the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune, you're basically at the beginning of an incredibly rewarding, exciting journey watching all of his movies, whether it's Santa Sangre or Holy Mountain or whatever the case might be. But El Topo, this is the film that really got his career up and running, but it's a key film to digest and internalize and wrestle with if you want to understand the cult movie and midnight movie phenomenon. And along those same lines, the next movie is just as important, if not more so, David Lynch's Eraserhead from 1977. David Lynch is one of my favorite living filmmakers, and he's made a lot of my favorite movies, but at this time, he'd only made a couple of really brilliant shorts like Alphabet. Watch Alphabet, it'll fucking blow your mind. But Eraserhead took years to make, and he scraped together the resources from people like Sissy Spacek and his, delivering newspapers or AFI grants, whatever it took to keep the film alive. But what emerged at the end of the process is what, for me, maybe the best movie ever made, capturing the anxieties and horrors of facing adulthood, becoming a parent. It has some of the most nightmarish imagery that I've ever seen in a movie, but I wouldn't describe it as like a horror film. It's just disturbing as fucking hell at times, but also wildly humorous and delightful. And it's just this incredible dreamlike experience that completely sucks you in. And one of my favorite anecdotes about somebody who's seen the movie, when Mel Brooks was considering hiring David Lynch as the director for Elephant Man, they arranged a screening of Eraserhead for him. And apparently when Mel Brooks walked out of the theater, he walked up to David Lynch and kissed him on the mouth. That might be apocryphal, but it makes for a great story. And I don't know if there's a better filmmaker out there when it comes to being coy in their responses about trying to pin down what a movie means. I mean, that old expression, life doesn't make sense, why should art? But like when asked about Wild at Heart and what it's about, he said, it's about 2 hours and 15 minutes. He won't even talk about how the character or the creature nicknamed Spike was created for this movie, which I think is very smart on his part. It keeps this movie mysterious. If he explained everything and kind of opened up his bag of tricks, well, then a lot of the mystery would be lost. And I don't need to know how they managed to shoot a scene of like yanking giant sperm cells out of a girl and tossing them and splattering them against the wall. But what we do know is that this movie did generate some serious box office and launched an incredible career. And those early screenings were attended by very few people, but then it eventually would run for 99 weeks at New York's Waverly Cinema. It ran for 3 years at the New Art Theater in LA. For a movie that's basically held together by duct tape, it ended up grossing $7 million in the United States. So this is one of those cult movies and midnight movies that has absolutely earned its reputation and sustained its reputation for many decades, and it's always worth revisiting, whether you've seen it 100 times or never at all. Now for the next movie on this list, I have to pause to give a quick shout out to artist Tony Stella, because this is one of his recommendations, and the whole reason I'm doing this list in the first place is because of yet another movie which I'll be discussing later in the video, where he did the art for the Blu-ray cover. But when I was about to do this video, I posted on Twitter, what are the essential midnight movies, cult classics, etc. And I have to admit, I've been remiss in my duties when it comes to Japanese genre cinema. And, like any film buff, I love watching Japanese cinema. But sometimes the really shocking, graphic ones that kind of shake and rattle your cage and wake you up and shock you out of your complacency, a lot of those I have yet to see. But this next one's a barn burner, and it's part of a series. But I've got Female Prisoner 701 Scorpion from 1972. This is the debut feature film by Shunya Ito, starring the legendary Meiko Kaji. I hope I'm saying her name correctly because she's an icon. I mean, she was in the movie Lady Snowblood. She was an astonishing singer. She did a ton of movies, but she's got a voice like a goddamn angel that will just like send chills through your soul while you're watching this movie, in spite of the fact that it's a pretty fucking rough story. And the 70s were filled with all kinds of wild women in prison films, movies like Big Dollhouse, which I also really enjoy, but this one, oh my God, it really got to me, mostly because Meiko Kaji, her performance is so stunning, and she has this uncanny ability to strike a pose and glare, and you're like, oh my God, like, whatever you do, I'm with you, I'm rooting for you. And I'm not alone in responding this way, because this movie was followed by a lot of sequels, and apparently some of the sequels are even better, so I've got those to look forward to. but younger moviegoers will recognize the music in this because it was later reused in the Kill Bill movies. But when it comes to just really shocking, memorable images, I mean, just like a parade of nude prisoners going through tunnels in and around obstacles in the prison, or all the cruel, sadistic torture sequences, this movie, holy crap, it's just like a wonderful, beautiful slap to the face. If you're feeling tired but you're in the mood to watch a movie, consider throwing in Female Prisoner 701 Scorpion. But the next one on my list is equally shocking and enticing, but also very beautiful and very enjoyable. It's almost like two movies kind of hiding in one, but this comes from a recommendation from a good friend, Marcus Penn from Penland Empire, and it's The Harder They Come from 1972, directed by Perry Henzell and starring the legendary Jimmy Cliff. Now, there was a time where most conventional moviegoers had no idea what reggae music was, and a lot of people credit this movie with introducing reggae to the outside world. And I'm not an expert on the history of reggae, so I don't know to what extent that is true. All I can say is that this movie will blow your fucking mind. I saw clips of it a million times growing up. Anytime you walked into like a CD store or a record store, there would be a very good chance that the VHS of this movie would be playing in the store, and they would be selling the soundtrack and that sort of thing. And so I always kind of felt like I had seen it. I was like, oh, that's that reggae movie. It's got some cool tunes. But what I didn't know is that in a lot of ways, this is like the Scarface of Jamaica, where it's loosely based on this counterculture hero or icon or outlaw. And so whether you want to watch it as a movie about the reggae biz or just a movie about a badass outlaw from the country who makes a big name for himself, I just was floored by the experience. And just the dialogue alone is magical because it's a really specific accent and dialect, and a lot of people require subtitles while watching it, but there's something that's just incredibly raw and immediate and undeniable about this movie where you just can't take your eyes off of it, and you're going to want to watch it immediately again when it finishes. And so thankfully, due to Roger Corman's New World Pictures, this movie was picked up and released in America and given a nationwide kind of midnight movie circuit or release pattern. And from that point on, it just became a genuine, beloved cult classic. The next movie on my list, Liquid Sky from 1982, is the most current movie that I have on here. So yeah, I guess with my next volume, I'll have to try to squeeze in a few more contemporary movies. But if you've never heard of Liquid Sky, apart from the just absolutely legendary poster art, it was directed by Slava Sukerman, and it stars Anne Carlisle in two roles, one a male, one a female. And this is an absolute quintessential New York time capsule. New York in the early 80s was a very different beast. And there's something about this period where the drugs and the new wave fashion and the crazy sex addicts, it was just a very specific time and place and flavor where the city was dangerous, it was filthy, but amidst that already very heady brew, a very intense mix of influences, this movie also introduces aliens, and it's an alien that's extracting the endorphins produced by the brain when orgasms occur. So at the core of this movie, you had this character played by Anne Carlisle who keeps accidentally killing people anytime she has sex with them. But apart from that fantastic premise, what I like about this is just between the photography and the music, it's just stylistically and tonally unique. I've never seen another movie quite like it. It is a world and a universe unto itself, and thankfully, people did appreciate it when it came out. It grossed $1.7 million at the box office, which made it the most successful independent film of that year. But I guess in my mind, if I were to think about what is the quintessential New York cult film, I mean, there are a lot of contenders. There's movies like Basket Case, which will be included in my volume 2. But I don't know why. When I think of New York and independent cinema and cult cinema, Liquid Sky will always be in the mix at the top of that list. But let's go back now to 1972 to quite a different kind of movie, and this is yet another Tony Stella recommendation. But we got Lone Wolf and Cub, Sword of Vengeance. This movie was directed by Kenji Misumi, and it stars, I hope I'll say this correctly, Tomisaburo Wakayama, or at least I hope I'm close, but Lone Wolf and Cub, it was a Japanese manga series created by writer Kazuo Koike and artist Goseki Kojima. Please say I got vaguely kind of sort of right on any of those, but the comic first came out in 1970, and then it led to these 6 films. And this movie became a cult phenomenon in kind of a strange, indirect way, where it was kind of compiled and re-edited from the first two movies and released in America on VHS as Shogun Assassin. And that's where a lot of people like Quentin Tarantino first got exposed to it. And if what you're in the mood for is just balls to the wall, kick-ass, gruesome samurai action, look no further. This is the movie. You have a former executioner who's now basically on the run, taking odd jobs, and he's on the run with his son, a baby, and he gave the baby a choice between a ball and a sword. The baby chose the sword, so he's now his partner in crime. And this is one of those movies where it's so good and so entertaining that it's almost a shame to see it, because it makes so many other movies feel so lame and so toothless and so cautious by comparison. This is one of those movies that just fucking kicks ass with awesome imagery and just savage violence and just full of badass attitude. I think that's what a lot of times a lot of action movies forget, is that in addition to the horrific violence, the character has to be the coolest motherfucker who has ever walked or crawled. And thankfully, Criterion has kept this movie in circulation, so it looks great, it's pristine. If you've never seen it, never heard of it, hunt this bad boy down. But the next one on our list maybe is the most controversial midnight movie ever released in America. I mean, there are a lot of films that can lay claim to being the wildest cult film, but none of them are quite as filthy and trashy as this one. I'm talking about The Great Pink Flamingos from 1972. Given to us by John Waters, a.k.a. the Pope of Trash, the Duke of Dirt, the Prince of Puke, the Ayatollah of Assholes, and the Anal Ambassador. And 50 years later, it's still kind of cult. It's hard to find. I was trying to stream it last night. Not available anywhere legally. If you want to watch it, you need to buy the Criterion Blu-ray. And I guess that's kind of oddly appropriate that even 50 years later, this movie is still radioactive.
Could you give us some of your political beliefs?
Kill everyone now. Condone first-degree murder. Advocate cannibalism. Eat shit. Filth are my politics. Filth is my life.
But it's the first of the so-called trash trilogy, which also includes Female Trouble and Desperate Living. And I almost went Female Trouble for this list, but then I was talked out of it by my friends. They're like, no. Pink Flamingos, that was the sensation. For midnight movies, it's Pink Flamingos all the way. And as I was doing a little research on it, I looked up the entry on Wikipedia, and I'm not quite sure if this description was meant to be funny or not. Nonetheless, it is. But the quote reads as, it features a number of increasingly revolting scenes that center on exhibitionism, voyeurism, sodomy, masturbation, gluttony, vomiting, rape, incest, murder, cannibalism, castration, foot fetishism, and concludes through the accompaniment of How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, with Divine's consumption of dog feces, the real thing, narrator Waters assures us. I mean, I'm sure there's some people who would read that and be like, oh my God, this movie must be burned, but I read that, I'm like, this sounds fucking great. And it is. I mean, it was shot for $10,000. Divine is an absolute force of nature. She's incredible. I mean, she basically, what John Wayne was to John Ford, or what Robert De Niro was to Martin Scorsese, Divine is to John Waters. And I used to show scenes from this movie to my friends in college on VHS just to kind of battle test them or see if I could break their backs. And no matter how many times I saw it, whenever we got to the final scene, I would start kind of choking and dry heaving. And just when you see Divine gagging herself, I mean, I'm just at that point, I'm like rushing for the toilet. But in the end, it's just a wildly enjoyable, shocking experience, and it has not lost one iota of its power in all this time. But finally, we come to the movie, which is the reason why I'm doing this list in the first place. So, Thriller, A Cruel Picture from 1973. I bought the Blu-ray from Vinegar Syndrome a while back, mostly because Tony Stella had done the cover art. But the movie stars Christina Lindberg and was directed by Bo Arne Vebenius, if I'm saying that right. And he said that the failure of his first film prompted him to make this, and he said his intention was to create, quote, a commercial as hell crap film. And the actors apparently had a clause in their contracts to ensure that they would not reveal who the director of the film really was. But in the words of Quentin Tarantino, Thriller is the roughest revenge movie ever made. And I don't know if I would disagree with that. It is pretty goddamn intense. This is a full-blown, hardcore, X-rated porn film mixed with essentially what's like a hooker revenge saga with heroin and martial arts and, fast speed car chases, and like everything about this movie is completely insane and glorious. But it's also a strangely muted and subdued movie because the protagonist of the film, she's mute. She suffered yet another horrible trauma early in her life, but life isn't through throwing horrible curveballs at her because she gets kidnapped and then force-fed drugs to get her hooked, and then basically told that in order to maintain access to her supply, she will have to work as a prostitute servicing these really deranged clientele. But then the movie slowly but surely turns into this hardcore badass revenge saga. And I don't know if there's a more iconic image in all of kind of cult films or grindhouse films than that image of Christina Lindbergh wearing that eye patch, wielding a shotgun. But it slowly but surely becomes so fucking badass. But while you're seeing all these karate training sequences or learning how to handle high performance vehicles, it's interwoven with all these really graphic, extreme close-ups that you basically could never see outside the most lurid XXX movies. And apparently Christina Lindbergh was not involved in any of the hardcore sex scenes at all. They were basically just inserted to try to make the movie more marketable. But when it comes to grindhouse movies, shocking movies, Thriller: A Cruel Picture might be the most gruesome and visceral and exciting of them all. But at last we come to one of my all-time favorite cult movies, and I don't even know if you can call it a cult movie anymore because it's now become so beloved that a lot of people feel like it's the best movie ever to come out of Great Britain, or at a minimum, the best horror film, or the best, folk horror film ever to come out of Britain. Maybe the best folk horror film ever made, but for a long time, The Wicker Man was hard to find. It was hard to see in any version, and there were a lot of different competing butchered versions out there that were just all horribly dismembered. And there have been many attempts over the years to reassemble a version that's pretty close to what the filmmakers originally intended. But thankfully now The Wicker Man is very easy to see, and goddamn, it fucking delivers. I absolutely love and adore this movie, and I have to be very careful about discussing it because if you've not yet seen it, maybe this is the one movie ever. If I were to say there's one movie that you don't want to have spoiled for you, it would be The Wicker Man, because it starts out as this really eerie mystery where this police officer goes to this remote island, Summer Island, and searching for a missing girl, and is appalled to encounter a culture that worships this kind of pagan religion. They find themselves to be a deeply religious people, but they're led by the great Sir Christopher Lee, playing a role which he regarded as the greatest role that he ever played, and I might be inclined to agree. But this movie has an otherworldly atmosphere, beautiful photography, extraordinary folk music. I mean, from the moment the opening credits begin, that music will transport you to another world. And then when it finally does kick into high gear and become a proper horror movie, it delivers and delivers big time. So ignore the Nicolas Cage and focus on the original Wicker Man. Goddamn, you will not be disappointed. Now that's officially 10 movies, but I'm going to include one bonus round or an honorable mention because you can't talk about midnight movies or cult movies or obscure movies without at least mentioning one movie associated with Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol, he directed a lot of movies and he produced a lot of movies. And for my bonus round, I'm going to go with Trash from 1970, directed by Paul Morrissey. And because of Andy Warhol's so-called factory, he tried to make underground heroes and icons out of a lot of very eccentric characters. And some of these projects are almost the antithesis of cinema or entertainment, where it's just people kind of mumbling or sleeping ad nauseum. But thanks to director Paul Morrissey, as well as actor Joe D'Alessandro, but Andy Warhol's productions found a different gear thanks to Paul Morrissey. And Trash is part of a trilogy, one that includes Flesh from 1968 and Heat from 1972. But basically, this movie is about a day in the life of the world's most attractive heroin addict who everyone in New York is trying to screw. Men, women, everything in between. If you're looking for a fast-paced movie with high production value, with riveting dialogue, this will not deliver. But if you just want to see a series of strange kind of chapters and escapades in this guy's life as everybody's just kind of hurling themselves at him while he sits around completely fucking nude with his ding-a-ling hanging out, mumbling away on the nod, well then this movie will absolutely deliver. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I enjoy Trash, although the first scene where this really hot stripper is trying to cure the impotence of the male lead is particularly enjoyable. But there will be an audience out there, it's small but passionate, where when they see Trash, they'll know that this movie was made just for them. So that's all I've got for this list for now. As I said, I'll be back for Volume 2 some point down the road. I still have a lot of cult films that I want to see, but I've got dozens, if not hundreds, that I could easily make a couple other videos about right now. But most important of all, I would love to hear from viewers out there which films they regard to be the most essential or just their personal favorites, because I feel like this is a journey that will never be completely finished for me. But this video for now is finished. But before I go, I got to give a quick shout out to my sponsor, Manscaped. If you haven't heard already, it's smooth sack summer, or at least as long as summer lasts. When you're playing in what remains of the summer sun, make sure you're escaped from pubes to bum. That's right, this is the summer and or fall to keep your balls cool while still looking hot with Manscaped. The leader in below the belt grooming is making sure we all have a ball this summer by giving our pants partners everything they need to stay fresh. Dive headfirst into smooth sack summer by going to manscaped.com for 20% off plus free shipping with our code WRONGREEL. That's WRONGREEL in all caps. And Wrong Reel is my podcast where we tackle film history every week. We've got well over 600 episodes. If you enjoy discussions about film history, be sure to check out Wrong Reel. But if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. But I can't thank you enough for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.